Because to me, it's just like, it's just incredible to me that, I mean, I like how you followed all the threads and just never gave up, but it was, I still can't, like one day I'll think, oh yeah, it's definitely murder. And then the next time I'm like, no way, she took a flyer on her own. And it's just, I mean, and
Yeah,
that's another thing I like about the book is you don't try to uh, enforce any of, if you have a notion about it yourself, you're keeping it pretty private because it's sort of like, yeah, these are the facts, figure it out.
yeah, that bit
That was
about
on
her,
purpose, yes.
Yeah, well
you did a
done.
great
Because
job at that.
Thank
And
you.
at that bit with her and the kidnapping, like, that is the element that just makes me keep going back when I think of the suicide, because if she's going to set this up, this elaborate kidnapping, obviously she's doing that to protect the guy's feelings, but also maintain a position of a character trait that she wants to keep with this guy. Like, she's still vulnerable. So if that's so elaborate just for that, and the whole element that you brought up where she didn't give him CPR, the child.
I didn't say that. I
Oh,
just
I
said
thought-
that's,
I thought that
no,
was-
what I said was that
EMTs.
the fire department's report said no one saw her giving him CPR. That's what it said.
yeah,
Because I don't know. I mean, she told Jonah, according to him, that she gave him a few breaths. That's what he was quoted as saying. Who knows what she told him, but
right.
they thought that she had been giving him CPR. They wouldn't have tried to get him back again because 25 or 30 minutes, you're going to be brain dead, right? So,
Right. Yeah.
so I don't know. I don't know whether she was or, didn't know how, or she did and she stopped before they got there, which seems weird. So who knows? I mean, you can hear on the tape, she's yelling out a lot. So if you're doing CPR,
Yeah, you're kind of busy doing something else.
Yeah, it's just, it reminded me of another story from another one of my books, which is Poison Love. Kristen Rossum called
I know this case,
911 and said, my husband's not breathing, and they said, well, can you put him on the floor? She said, okay. So she pulled him off the bed and onto the floor, and they told her, how to start doing CPR. So, and they told her to count, and so when the paramedics got there, she's in the living room with the cordless phone and her husband's on the floor in the bedroom. So she was pretending to do CPR on the phone. So the prosecutor of that case had been a paramedic. So he was immediately suspicious of that, just that alone. Because first of all, if you have a cordless phone and you're trying to do CPR, it's almost physically impossible. So in this case, when I heard the 911 tape, I thought, well, she could be doing CPR, but she seems to be yelling out a lot of instructions too. So
yeah, is this the San Diego case? Is this the San Diego case?
That was my first book.
With the rose petals?
Right. Yeah, and so what happened was she wasn't expecting that when everybody came that her husband would have to be on the floor. So she took the rose petals, which she had put into the bed, and pushed him off the bed, right, to recreate the scene on the floor. And they found little red streaks on the sheet where she had pushed the rose petals on the white sheet, and she'd left little streaks.
Wow.
And then she took this photo that she said he had under the pillow or was holding or something, and she put it on the floor next to him as if he could be looking at it, when in fact she recreated the whole thing. She wasn't thinking very clearly. She was probably on meth. So anyway, when you're in the middle of doing something and making up a story, you leave clues for people to come back later and say, well, that's not what happened. But like I said, all I know is what it said in the fire report, that he didn't see her doing CPR, but who knows?
Yeah, I thought that was a fascinating case, I mean, especially since, well, I mean, it seems like you have sadly personal knowledge of suicide, but also you've made a study of it. And the rose petal thing and the whole way it was set up sounded more to me like like a woman committing suicide than a guy. I don't think I've seen guys with rose petals, you know, and stuff like that. That seems more the kind of scene that a woman would set. And
Right.
I mean, did that click with investigators right away, or?
No, I didn't, because it was UCSD campus police was who responded, and they were not trained in homicide cases.
Yeah.
So they came in and looked around a little bit, tried to back up part of her story, didn't really looked at the trash, I think, that was outside on the balcony. This was an apartment. And saw a soup can. So they said, oh, well, that fits the rest of her story, that she came home from work at lunch and gave him some soup. And that's about as far as they looked. But nobody realized, what he had actually taken or had been given was fentanyl. And so later, once they realized there were no syringes and no paraphernalia, no drug containers, no anything, they were like, well, how did it get in his body then? Because that wasn't at the scene. And even though the UCSD campus police didn't know what they were doing, at least they made a good report. So they said, obviously there was nothing noted. So when it got handed over to San Diego PD, but that's an interesting thing. See, so that was a staged suicide. And I say this case is either a staged suicide or it's a staged homicide, but one way or the other, it's a staged event. That is the only real opinion that I'm willing to state, because I can't tell whether it was a suicide or a homicide because we have too many unanswered questions. And, some of the forensic evidence just doesn't make sense for it to be suicide. But then there are these other things that point to suicide. So honestly, this is new. I had this on my Facebook page this week. The sheriff has announced he is going to retire, which I knew. But I thought that somebody else was going to step in and he was going to retire now. That's what I had heard, because so he's not going to run again, but he is going to stay in his position until next year, which is interesting because the way he got the job in the first place was his predecessor had Alzheimer's, and he was brought in to kind of pave the way for him to be elected. So he was the I don't remember what his title was, under sheriff or assistant sheriff or something. So he was in place politically so that when the sheriff stepped down and retired, Sheriff Gore was then elected because he'd been essentially doing the job and he was already in a supervisory position. So that's what I thought was going to happen in this case, and it's not. So the reason this is important is because he has been pretty firm in saying, we're not reopening this case and da-da-da-da. But the guy who ran against him in the last election and didn't lose by that much, I think it was only a 4-point percentage difference. He's going to run again. He just announced he's going to run again. And he said, I will reopen this as a criminal case if I'm elected. He said that at the time, and that's the only reason why Sheriff Gore agreed to do a review after the jury verdict was political pressure. So once he's retired, and this guy, since he ran before and he's going to have name recognition, he's also run for an assembly seat and he didn't get that either, but he's stayed very active politically. And he was a commander, which is a very high, I called him a lieutenant, which I was mistaken. He was actually a commander. And he's he was the highest ranking openly gay member of the sheriff's department, and he's very much more of an activist and wants transparency, and said that there were I can't remember exactly, it's in my book, but I don't want to misquote him, but it's something like there were people that did not agree with the suicide thing. And he's also, I think, in favor of this lawsuit that the Zahaus filed recently, that is still pending, where they're trying to get more investigative documents, internal investigative documents. And this guy, Dave Myers, is saying that he thinks those documents will actually question the suicide findings. So I don't know if there really are these documents, but I know they're trying to get them if they do exist. So I don't know if they would be notes or internal emails between detectives or whatever, but they were not part of the official investigative file that I got, because I would definitely have noticed those. So I'm not sure they exist, but they've been denied in numerous records requests by the House. And I'm kind of thinking, though, if they didn't exist, they wouldn't have denied the requests the way they did. Maybe they would just say, we don't have any such records. They didn't say that. They denied the records request based on state law. Public records request protects investigative documents, et cetera. So it sounds like there's something that might be there. So not only if so this is going to be an open field, so no incumbent, and he's already almost, he came so close last time. I think he has a pretty good chance of winning. Yeah. And so the case is definitely not over. And this has all happened within the last week or two, because there was a judge ruling. The county tried to get this lawsuit dismissed, and the judge, this is a separate judge from the civil trial. This is a new judge, and he cited a number of things which made it sound like he was going to support forcing the sheriff's department to release these documents, which is pretty unusual, because there is precedent here that protects all law enforcement agencies in California, which has been very frustrating to me in the past. You would ask for these. I did an a public records request for some investigative records in the Manson case when I co-wrote Hunting Charles Manson. And even though that case is 50 years old and is supposedly closed, right, with 9 members of the Manson family convicted.
Yeah, and he's dead now.
And they still won't release these investigative records under this, I think, the same statutes and the same protection. So if this judge forces the sheriff's department to release these records, I think that might actually set a pretty good precedent for reporters and people, authors like me, and who to ask for these things and actually get them, because there's a lot of times where I just can't get records, and it's really annoying. The case is not adjudicated in court. So if there's a plea bargain made, so for example, Lost Girls, my book about the John Gardner, Chelsea King, Amber Dubois case, I don't know if you know that one, based on the Chelsea's law that we got on, restricting and making it more difficult for sexual predators, et cetera, blah, blah, blah. So even in that case, he made a deal, and there was never any trial. So I, again, asked the sheriff's department, can I have these records from the case? No, didn't go to court. These are not public records. So I'm just saying, it's hard to get these kind of law enforcement investigative reports released. I mean, I got them through a source. I did not get them from the sheriff's department. I have a couple of good sources that gave me the entire file. And so my book is full of stuff that was never released publicly, not to reporters, not at the trial, not anywhere. So that's nice.
It is nice. Well, it's really difficult to get your hands on anything. I mean, I volunteered with the LA Police Museum for several years, and
that's interesting.
I really liked it a lot. And when the executive director left, he's now executive director of the Memorial Fund for LAPD. And when he left, I sort of segued.
I wish I had known all this. I wish I had known you when I was doing the Manson book. Dang it.
Manson is also sheriff's department. Because
anyway, sorry to interrupt you.
That's cool. When they did that bust out at Spawn, and later on at the other bust, that was sheriff's.
I know.
Yeah, that was sheriff's department. And
if you read the book, you'll see that what I talked about was back in those days. You had even the 2 divisions of LAPD weren't sharing information, let alone LAPD and Sheriff's Department. So when they raided Spawn Ranch, they had no idea that these people were under investigation, or the details of these other deaths that happened outside of the sheriff's jurisdiction. And if they had just shared information, they could have solved it much sooner and probably saved some lives. So anyway.
Yeah, it's hard to say. I mean, because when they did go out there, really the sheriff's department was just busting them for all the Volkswagens and stuff that they'd been.
I know, they thought they were
You know,
an auto
weapons, and
theft
they were,
ring.
and
Yeah.
they were, but
Yep.
that's
I
not
know.
the only thing they were up
Right.
to, obviously.
Right. Right.
But there, it was just like, because I think that there was, there just, I don't even know if they could have put it together much sooner than they did.
Oh, no, they could have. They
You
could
think?
have. Yes, because there was one member of one of the teams that tried talking to one of the members of the other teams about some details.
Right.
The pig written in blood
Right.
message at what's his face's house. I can't remember all the names now.
I know.
Bobby,
Bobby Hinman. Is that his name?
was
Yeah,
the pig
No,
Hinman.
or
no, Hinman was the guy that was
Yeah,
the
the
guy
first
that was
one.
the guy that was
The
the
first one.
Buddhist.
So
and
the guy, so they had that information from that case, and they tried to talk to the LAPD who had investigated the Tate murder because there was pig written on the door, and they were trying, oh no, that's not the same thing. These are drug dealers. So yeah.
No, that's right. That's right. I've forgotten about that because the sheriff's department was kind of all over it, you know, because they had they had some other, but that's the thing when they don't play well together. And I mean, there's been instances in the past where they have, but it's always frustrating because it's sort of like, I always think of it like UCLA and USC. It's a crosstown rivalry, and they always want to be the first one, and it's just it can be frustrating. But they have, I mean, examples of them working well together would be some of the serial killer cases in the 80s, and like when they put together a task force for Hillside Strangler, when they put together, when they did a couple of those other high profile serial killer cases in Los Angeles at that time, they actually did have people, and they also had people not just like for Night Stalker too. They also had people from outlying agencies, from some of the smaller agencies that were, that had victims in their jurisdictions.
Well, it's just like the Golden State Killer too. I mean, that one, although I don't blame the police agencies because I think there were so many probably jurisdictions where he did that. But if they had shared, they probably would have caught him a lot sooner too. So there you go. Yeah. That's a message to law enforcement. Share. Your parents teach you to share.
It's not that difficult. There's glory enough for everybody. That the idea is to get the bad guy.
Exactly.
I mean, that should be the whole thrust of everything. But I'm particularly interested in your career because you started as you started as a journalist because you still got that tenacity, and that, that sort of like that bulldog, like, but in a more quiet way, because I can see that. I think you would be disarming. I think that you would be able to ask for things in such a way that people wouldn't necessarily, be threatened.
Columbo.
Yeah, see, there you go. I think I can kind of see, although I don't see your trench coat being rumpled, but I can kind of see that one more thing.
Yeah, I do that, but I don't do that on purpose. Like, it's not contrived. It really is like, oh, one more thing, but yeah, no, when you set up your list of questions, I used to teach interviewing actually. So there is a strategy on how to do an interview. Yeah. And so basically I'll just briefly share that because I think it could be helpful for other writers if anyone's interested in that. I literally write my questions out in advance and I make sure to ask them in a way that is not loaded with any kind of opinion or bias whatsoever, because the minute you ask your question wrong, they'll stop talking to you because they immediately assume that you've already taken sides. And I've made mistakes during interviews where I'm interviewing a guy who's in jail waiting trial or sentencing, what have you, and I compliment the prosecutor and boom, that was wall comes down, So anyway, I literally write out my questions and I start with questions that, the idea is to build trust and credibility for yourself, because as an author, they don't have to talk to me. When I worked for the newspaper, I had way more power because I wasn't going away. And there were people who were very scared of me. in town, because I covered City Hall and I covered the County Board of Supervisors. I cover mayor's races, congressional races, politics, stuff like that. And I wasn't going anywhere, and they knew that, and they knew that they had to talk to me eventually. Like they started off, like there was a congressman down here. I don't know if you guys have heard of Congressman Bob Filner, who ended up getting pushed out because he sexually harassed like over 20 women.
Yeah, that sounds
including one of my former editors and good friends who ended up suing him, and that's why he had to go. But anyway, I remember doing an interview with him, and he was just so rude to me and insulting and nasty and angry. And I hung up the phone with him, and the next time I called his campaign manager and I said, he needs to apologize to me. Okay? He doesn't get to talk to me like that. I'm not talking to him again until he apologizes to me. So he had a real, and the campaign manager goes, yeah, we've been trying to get him to go to anger management and he just won't go. And I'm just like, and then he like started yelling at somebody who worked TSA or something in the airport somewhere. And I started laughing at the TV, and I immediately like typed a message to his former chief of staff, and I'm like, see, now it's out.
Well,
So anyway,
it was
my point,
interesting because when you talked to Adam, I got that sense that you got a lot of pushback from him too. Like he initially seemed like he was talking to you, and then he became almost like belligerent in future.
but
It
that
seemed
was
like you
that
knew
was
that.
many months later.
Was he like just seem like that kind of a person, an angry person, or do you think it was like?
You know, I don't really want to talk about Adam because I don't want to provoke him.
Oh, right.
So
Yeah.
if you don't mind, I don't really want to go
No,
there.
that's fine. But I was just wondering if that was a difficult interview too with him.
Well, it was difficult. The one, I'll talk about the first one and then I'll leave
Okay,
it there. He was very nervous about meeting with me, and I didn't want to screw up the potential for interviewing him again, but it didn't matter by the time that point came along because he was already had his mind made up apparently. But I wanted to get whatever I could from him, but I wasn't really ready to interview him yet. I have a process, and I wait until I know everything I need to know before I interview people, because you may only get one chance. And in that case, I did only get one chance because you never know. So I had a guy I used to work with who said, no, you should call him first. The first thing you should call the person, and then you can catch them lying later. I'm like, well, no, that's not how I do it. That's how you do it.
And then
So anyway, my interviewing thing is to get trust. So my goal meeting with Adam was to not confront him, not ask him anything about the case, let him talk about what he wanted to talk about to build a foundation for trust, and to sort of try to ask a few things. But I mean, like I said in the book, I sent him that text that was just a joke, or I said it to him, I think on the phone about the Ambien.
Yeah, about the Ambien.
And that was like, oops. So you can say one wrong thing and screw up the trust thing. So you have to be super careful. And, you know, he caught me off guard. I had just come back from dinner, and it was 9 o'clock at night, and I was not in work mode, and I just wasn't thinking the way, you know. So when you do an interview, even in a situation like that, and I wanted to talk to his brother. I didn't want to screw that up. I wanted to talk to his girlfriend, and that all eventually happened, but I didn't think it was going to, based on, you know, a lot of things. So yeah, I mean, you have to be entirely professional, and you have to be very non-confrontational. And I would get my students would be like, so you go into a prison or a jail and you don't ask them confrontational questions? Like, no, I don't, because if they think that I'm against them, then they're not going to talk to me.
No.
So
Yeah.
you have to be very careful how you ask questions and what questions you ask. And if you're only going to get one time, you need to ask the hard questions later. And then I always say, how much time do you have for me today? Because that way I can pace it, and I can, you know, and am I going to be able to get another interview? So I need to make sure that, I mean, I just did an interview. I'm not going to go into details with who it is, but I was really scared this person wasn't going to talk to me or wasn't going to talk to me again. And I needed that person's help. You know, it's a pretty major person in this case. And I just had to be super careful what I asked because I knew some of the things that I wanted to ask. He wasn't going to even like the fact that I asked them at all.
Mm.
And so I'm going to come back later at another time and maybe go deeper. But he started talking about this topic that I was saving for the end of my interview. And I'm like, oh, now what do I do? Because he was like starting to talk about things. And so I saw an opening, but I still was holding back because the wall could have just come right down. So.
Yeah, I think what I always think is that, well, somebody I really like a lot, he's a good friend, and as Gil Carrillo from the Sheriff's Department. He was one of the principal investigators on the Night Stalker case. And I think he's a phenomenal detective. And from what he's talked to me about the way he interviews people, when he was working homicide, he's retired now, of course, but when he was working homicide, journalists and homicide detectives, good ones, have a lot in common, I think. I mean, they really, really do, because he was basically saying the same thing that you were just saying, is that he tries to establish that connection. He doesn't go in, and I don't know if you've ever met him, but he's a big guy. He is a.
Did you say he works at the DA's office?
He's retired now out of the Sheriff's Homicide Bureau. He was one of the principal investigators with Frank Salerno on the Night Stalker case.
But did he work for the DA's office as their public information officer? Because I thought that name sounds familiar to me.
Yeah, he was. Well, the Netflix series that came out recently about the Night Stalker case. He was interviewed for that extensively, he and Frank. But what I found to be, and even historically, because when I write about stuff, I write about everybody that I write about is dead. I mean, the victim's dead, the cops, everybody's dead, because I write about historic cases. But it's the same thing. It seems to me like journalists and homicide detectives, or any detectives, go at it the same way. They want to establish that connection and open a line of communication, and without, because you don't have to pander to anything to do that.
But there's one important difference, because I've read a lot of transcripts of detectives interviewing, and what they do, which I don't think is ethical to do, but they are allowed to do.
They're allowed to lie.
They're allowed to lie. They're allowed to say they have information that they don't. But what they also do is they sympathize as offering a reason why. I understand why you felt like this. You probably felt like this, and you wanted to do this. Right? And I can't really do that, because that's crossing an ethical line for me. I mean, like private investigators can also misrepresent who they are, and they can make stuff up. I've worked with a PI before on doing research and stuff, and I always have to say, in order to keep this entire thing clean, ethically, for me, I need you not to do these things that you normally do, because if you're working with me and for me to give a package to somebody and my name's going to be on it, I cannot get information that way. So I am super ethical on how I conduct myself also, because what I will do though is I will share personal information sometimes. Like in this case, when I interviewed Jonah Shacknai, when I interviewed Michael Berger, who was Rebecca's, the one during the kidnapping, that boyfriend, I shared with them a lot of personal information about me and my husband, because what I was getting through these interviews was that I saw some pretty significant parallels in their behavior. And so, I'm not diagnosing Rebecca Zahau with borderline personality disorder, which my husband was diagnosed with during our marriage therapy, only the counselor wouldn't, she said, don't tell him. I'm telling you this, but don't tell him. I'm like, really? Which is entirely not ethical. Right?
No.
That was a horrible secret for me to have to keep.
That's horrible.
It's not therapeutic to him either. So
I think her reason was he's already feels so broken and helpless that this could just push him over the edge, But
then if he finds out some way that you knew, then he becomes betrayed. So that's worse.
Well, which he didn't, but she didn't help him, and she sent me a card after he hung himself, and basically, so I thought I could help him. Well, the problem was she was telling him the exact opposite thing that AA was teaching him. So he was getting opposing direction in 2 years. And so, you know,
Do you
anyway,
ever feel like working with a case that has similar aspects to what you went through traumatically? Does it ever trigger you personally? Like, how do you deal with that as a writer? Is there any like triggers that you see when you see the similarities to yourself personally? Does that make it easier to write about or more difficult because you're dealing with your own trauma?
it's been 22 years. It took me a long time to process what happened to me. I don't have, where's this? Oh, it's behind me here. Wait, hold on. I have this, which I usually have out, but now I have it underneath a plant and I don't want everything to come tumbling down here. This is my, it's short. You can see it's not very big. This took me 19 years to write.
I did see that on your, I
did
think it was
too.
on your blog or your Facebook page.
Yeah,
I
so
noticed
this
that.
is my story of my marriage and relationship with my husband. And I couldn't finish it until I sat through the Rebecca Zahow trial, actually. So that helped me get closure. What was difficult was sitting there listening to the psychiatrist who's testifying for the defense, Adam Shacknai's defense, the risk assessment factors that he does what's called a post-mortem suicide risk assessment for suicide, and basically listed a number of things, behaviors and other things that happened with Rebecca that made him believe that she died by suicide. And so I was basically reliving my relationship and going through that same list with what happened with me and with my husband. That was difficult. But once I process all that, I mean, I'm a journalist and I'm very analytical anyway. And so it actually, you know, that's how I sold this book to the publisher, was basically putting myself in it, and my own personal experience gave me a unique perspective on this case that nobody else really has. And I also don't have a narrative. I don't have an agenda. I don't have a horse or any other animal in this race. You know,
That's something that really complimented my writing style, is that it was right down the middle, just the facts. Like I couldn't detect any bias or something.
Right.
Thank you.
I really
Well,
find
yeah.
a great job at that, and that's something people should really applaud you for.
Thank you. Well, and it's really funny to me reading the reader reviews, because some people will say they really liked the fact that I put myself into it. I'm not in it a lot, but I mean, I am in it a little. But I read one review the other day. All she just sits there and talks about what a great reporter she is, and it's so arrogant and this and that. And I'm like,
I didn't get
and then
that.
there are other people who say, I really like the way that she put herself in there, and it really was interesting, and her insights and this and that. So I think on balance, I think more people like the fact that I put myself into it than didn't.
Yeah, let's fact check that review. Not true.
Right.
Thank you.
And also, I feel like it was somebody that didn't actually read it. You always have some people that didn't or got partway through and just took like a piece out of context. So.
Yeah, because I'm really not in it that much, you know, and I only put myself in when I thought it was useful. I didn't just put it in, you know, just to toot hear my sound of my own voice, you know.
No, I thought that was really clear.
Thank you. The only reason I put myself in at the very beginning actually is because the editor said, you know, you don't put yourself in until chapter 11, and it's kind of abrupt. So I think we should have something sooner. And I'm like, okay. So, you know.
Well, I think it's interesting though. Oh, I'm sorry.
I was going to say, so I put it in at the beginning, and then we're like, okay, so is it a prologue, or, because I didn't want two starts to the story. I didn't want my story starting the book. I wanted Rebecca's story starting the book, because it's about Rebecca, not me. So we made it a preface, which is not technically part of the story. You know what I mean? That was an interesting little process to try to figure out, because you know what, I'm reading this other website where these people who are a lot of self-published people, and they think readers don't like prologues. I'm like, what? Readers don't like bad prologues, you know, or badly written prologue, you're going to skip over that. Yeah. So do it right. But prologues, I think, are really useful if it's needed. They're not needed in every book. But anyway, I wanted to get back to the homicide versus reporter conversation that we were having a minute ago.
Yeah.
I have spent the last year writing a novel where the two main characters are a homicide detective and an investigative reporter, male, female. And I just sent it to my agent. So,
Oh, that's great.
Yeah.
That is great. Because to me, they just like my favorite historic Los Angeles reporter is a woman named Agnes Underwood. And Aggie Underwood worked for the Herald. She was a general assignment reporter, but she really specialized in crime. And she worked it when a lot of women didn't. And she earned the respect of police, sheriff's department, everybody she worked with. And I like that combination because like what you were talking about is that, you have this ethical line that you can't really cross as a journalist, and police have their own set of lines that, they can jump over that where you can't really. So I think it makes for a really good partnership because one can go someplace the other one can't, but then they can share the information.
Exactly. But here's the problem. The problem is they're on opposite sides of the table. So you're not supposed to be sharing information with the police if you're a reporter, but the police are always trying to get information from you, and you're always trying to get information from the police, and the police are trying to protect their investigation. So there's this inherent conflict, and it's between these two characters. So there's romantic tension, and then there's professional tension. So they do end up helping each other, sometimes inadvertently and sometimes on purpose. And then they're like, one of them is following the other one, and then the other one is following the other one, but neither one of them knows, so it's kind of fun. It's been a fun book. But, Michael Connelly, I went to, he read my first novel and gave me a blurb for me, which was awesome.
Awesome.
He only does one book per author per lifetime. So, but I heard him speaking at a conference, and my first novel is called Naked Addiction, by the way, if anybody wants to read fiction. That's my only novel so far, except for this one that I just wrote. But anyway, he said, he was a reporter for the LA Times. And the reason I know him is because he was friends with my boyfriend at the time, way back when, was his editor at the LA Times. And so we all four went to a concert together, and that's how I knew him at all. So, but he said that, he wrote one book called The Poet. I don't know if you guys have heard of that. It's one of my favorite books of his, right? And it has as the protagonist is a reporter, but he didn't do that again. And he said it's impossible almost to write a crime novel with a reporter as a hero because these ethical lines keep them from doing what a novel character needs to do. So I made the ethical conflict part of the plot and part of the conflict which you need in a story. But so it was a fun book to write, and I wrote it during COVID because I lost a book contract and I lost a ton of money that was supposed to come in this year. And so I had to pivot and immediately started working on this novel, and I wrote the first draft in like 3 months.
Oh, that's
and I just sat there, and I broke my neck and my shoulders, and I was on the floor with ice for the next 2 months. I was going crazy inside the house, and I'm like, I'll just write this novel. That's what I'll do.
Perfect. Well, but I mean, historically, police and journalists didn't have such an adversarial relationship. I mean, they always eyed each other with a fair amount of suspicion. But I mean, when Aggie was reporting, newspaper reporters had desks in police stations.
Yeah, well, and I think they still, when I worked at the Union Tribune here in San Diego, we always had an office in the police station. I don't know if they still do, but they did as long as I worked there. There was one person in there, whoever was the one police reporter.
Yeah, I just wonder because it's so adversarial that it's just like a boxing match every time. And it's so sad because I think there is a way to do it together if need be, that doesn't compromise both parties. But I think that it just doesn't happen. It just seems to me anyway, it doesn't happen.
Well, and here's another thing that was unique about my experience with writing Death on Ocean Boulevard, and that was, if you remember, there is a chapter where I meet with the sheriff's department and actually shared some of my leads, which I've never done in my life. But I said, look, I'm not a police officer. I don't have subpoena power. And if there's still a killer out there, I don't want to ask these certain questions to certain people. Why don't you guys follow up on this? Here's a bunch of, they're like, oh, this is all new information. And then, a week later, oh, no, we're not doing that. Well, we'd have to reopen the case. I'm like, okay.
Well, yeah. How about doing that? How about that for a start, reopening the case? I think that would be fantastic if they would.
I think they might actually get that done. If this guy Dave Myers becomes sheriff, there's a brand new ballgame. However, given the fact that we're 10 years later, this will be 11 years by next year, there are certain things that it's too late. For example, they should have taken Adam's phone. They should have looked at Adam's phone. They should have.
That just made my head explode. I thought, are you kidding? Anybody who's even watched cops on TV knows enough to take the phone. That I could not understand.
And they're not going to be able to get his records now at this point about where the cell towers pinged when he called his girlfriend, supposedly, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, I think they purged those after probably 7 years. Maybe it's only a year now. I don't know. But they don't like to give things to law enforcement anyway. But they do. But they also destroy things because they can't keep everything forever. So there's going to be, other information. They just aren't. DNA, they could retest some things with more modern technology that's more sensitive. I think they could still do that because there's some of those items where there were unknown profiles that were unidentified, but not Adam, right? Well, so who was that? Maybe maybe we need to know who that was. So.
Yeah, what about the physical evidence? I mean, because it wasn't declared a homicide, so is there still extant physical evidence that someone's keeping somewhere that could be?
As far as I know, if they've destroyed evidence in this case, saying, oh, it's 7 years, that would be crazy if they did that. I hope they didn't do that. But during the trial, let's see, so the trial was 2018, so that's 7 years. So they brought in one of the knives. I mean, they're not going to throw those away, I don't think. But I'm not sure about the, some of the stuff degrades too. So, it's like might be too old to test, or maybe there's not enough left of the original sample to test. That can happen. So for example, with Kristen Rossum from Poison Love, she had an attorney, like she went through all the appeals that she could and wore all those avenues out. And so finally got another attorney though, who wanted to, I think it was test her husband's blood to see if there were fentanyl metabolites, meaning was the fentanyl dumped into the blood afterwards, or did it get processed in the body? And are there signs, because that's what a metabolite is. Once you process it, that's something separate from the original chemical of the drugs. It's a different set of makeup, a different makeup. So because his blood from his stomach or his gastric contents or something was sitting in the refrigerator at the medical examiner's office, not protected in any way that anybody could have come in and messed with it. I mean, I think it was probably, Hail Mary kind of a thing. But the point was, they also didn't want to test it because if they were ever to get Michael Robertson, who was her unindicted co-conspirator, that's what prosecutors called him, who's since been indicted for conspiracy, but he's in Australia. So if he ever comes back to the United States, he'll be arrested, but he'll never come back, because I wrote a story saying that he was basically had this thing waiting for him, which he didn't know existed. They didn't want to use that blood to test in case they ever get him, because they're going to need that as evidence against him. So there are reasons to not test things. So
Sure.
oftentimes they do keep things. So in this case, I think that would be really stupid to throw anything away because there's been so much political pressure back and forth. But speaking of sharing and working together, the Coronado Police Department and the Sheriff's Department very much backed each other up on this case. So
That's interesting.
as
Yeah,
a suicide,
as a suicide.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, they had a vested interest, I think. I mean, at least on Coronado, that I think it would be the same thing like when there's a crime in Beverly Hills. There's certain places where, they just don't do that here, kind of thing. When there's enough money and enough whatever, it's sort of like, well, no, that happens over there, but doesn't happen, it doesn't happen to us, doesn't happen in our area. So it seems like they always have a vested interest in keeping that, a suicide is bad enough, and especially one that was so, if it was a suicide, one that was so dramatic. And so, I mean, because I remember seeing photographs when the case first, when it first broke, and I thought, whoa, what happened here? I mean, that's just insane.
Well, so some of the things that I know they did keep, for example, because they brought them into the trial, or they had pictures anyway. And I know that some of these experts were able to examine, but they examined the photos. I don't know that they were able to examine the actual evidence, but they preserved the bindings on her. That they took them off her wrists and put them on these cardboard tubes, and they had pictures of that. And then they also had pictures of the ropes on her, behind her, so there's still all those photos. And since then, there was a guy, I'm trying to remember, it was on the Oxygen Network. They had a limited series. There was a guy who is a cold case investigator who looked at one of the photos and said he saw the fingerprint of a leather glove that has a certain texture and a certain look to it, so he thought that there was a killer wearing gloves because it doesn't look like a fingerprint. Paul Holes, yeah. So, and he saw that as an imprint on one of her nails because of the black paint. So that was interesting. I mean, but that was his interpretation. But yeah, there are things like that that maybe they could still look at those things. So
yeah, go ahead.
Like the thing that popped up in my head that you'd have a unique point of view on is that because you're so entrenched in this, is that the case inside and out, and then you were talking about. I mean, you never got into details on it. I could see why all the like weird conspiracy theories and stuff that came out of it. Like, what was the craziest one that you saw? And like, it had to give you a whole new dynamic on the conspiracy theory culture.
The reason I didn't go into that is because the reason that I wrote the book was to dispel a lot of the speculation that were behind those, because they were based on things that weren't true. Just like we have COVID today, and there are all these people who don't want to get a vaccination because there's all this misinformation. Oh, it's going to change your DNA structure. Really? Okay. A lot of people think that, though.
Yeah, they do.
Right? Because they don't understand science. Well, so I kind of didn't go into those things for that reason, but there was, the hitman theory, and there were all kinds of things which I can't say or put in a book or I'll get sued. That's the other reason I don't want to talk about them. No, there's plenty of stuff I could get sued for if I talked about it. So I have to be careful about that.
Also, I know you obviously have an opinion, not that you said it in the book because you want to show all the sides, but did your opinion change as you did more research, or you still have?
No, I said at the beginning, maybe you weren't on. I don't have an opinion. I don't know. Okay. I don't know whether it was a suicide or a murder.
I was just wondering how it, like, if it progressed and you saw different things as you went along.
It was a tennis match for me. Right. I was like, it's a suicide. It's a murder. It's
which is really how it feels like in the book, like as a reader.
I was recreating that for you.
Yeah.
Because that's what I went through. I mean, I have a retired sheriff's, I can't remember if he's a lieutenant or, anyway, he said he had the same thing. He said,
Yeah.
I went in thinking one thing and I was reading, he kept sending me progress reports. It was so cute.
Right.
He sent me, I'm on page 67 and I think this, and now I'm on page, you know.
Well, I also felt like that way about Max, because I felt in the beginning something, and as you went along, you're like, oh, wait a second, like I feel differently about it. And then back like a ping pong match, all of a sudden I was like, well, maybe not. It was really hard to.
Yeah, that was a weird one too. I mean,
Yeah.
the 911 call
Yeah.
for Max was pretty weird. There was a
Yeah.
lot of space and time and a lot of weird noises. And I'm like, is somebody else there? I mean, I was like,
I feel like it's something connected. It's not in a bubble.
oh, well, they were interrelated, most
Yeah,
definitely.
it's just how they're interrelated is there's something missing, like a little something that connects it all.
Yeah, but so this isn't a conspiracy theory. This is just a theory. But and I think even though the detective, the lead detective, didn't want to talk to me for the book, there is a theory that she apparently had, which was that Rebecca was angry at Jonah. And she kind of tested that out when she was doing the interview with Jonah. She says, well, think about this. What if, you know, so this is the homicide detective talking to the person. What if, you know, she was angry at you because she thought you blamed her, even though you keep saying you didn't blame her? What if she thought you blamed her because you wouldn't let her come to the hospital?
Right.
She loved that little boy, but you wouldn't let her come, and you didn't want her to be in the room to even see him. And you like you said, you didn't really call her that much to ask her how she was, or you in fact didn't ask her how she was doing. You know, maybe she was angry.
Mm-hmm.
And so this was, you know, and so I extrapolating that a little bit more, maybe that note and the whole scene, that's a theory that she was angry. And this was a message to Jonah. And so I talked to Jonah about that. And he said, I've heard that theory. I said, well, what do you think that message would be? He says, I don't know. And I said, okay, well, your brother thinks that this bondage is really shibari, Japanese self-tying erotic / artistic practice. Did you guys ever watch movies about bondage, or did that ever come up, or was that no, not with me, he said. And so this is one opinion that I will state, and that is the way she was tied up, whether it was a suicide or a homicide, that is the key. There's something about bondage. There are secrets in this case that somebody's keeping, because why was she tied up like that?
Yeah.
Right? I mean, that to me is the key. So you figure that out, ask more questions, find more people, see what that's about, and maybe you can solve it. Maybe it was a suicide. Maybe there was bondage in her life, or in some fashion that some people are not talking about. So I don't know.
She did have other relationships.
Right. But the thing is, it wasn't on her computer per se, like, how do you tie yourself up for suicide? That there was no kind of browser history specifically about tying herself up or whatever. So her sister says, well, there's nothing on her computer. How would she even know how to do this or think of doing it? Which I think is a valid point, but it doesn't mean she didn't know anything about it. By the same token, maybe, that's a lot of the reason why people think it was a killer, right? Because it was seemed like a very angry and demeaning thing to do to her and leave her like that, and the note was angry, and the way it was painted seemed angry. And so there's stuff we don't know. So if they reopen the case, those would be the areas that I would say are ripe for more investigation.
I'd like to see you do a follow-up of some sort.
I probably will.
That would be fantastic.
I mean, they reopen the case, I'm going to update this book for sure. And there's some things in the works that I can't talk about, but yes.
that would be fantastic, because I still am just left with more questions than answers about
That's what the judge said.
And it's just there's just so much But it does seem to me that Jonah was punishing her for sure by not letting her come to the hospital. So even if he wasn't overtly
I don't know
angry,
if that's,
it seemed like a
I
it
don't
seemed
know
like
if
a
that's
punishment.
true. I
Really?
don't know if that's true. I mean, I think that's a valid theory, but I'm saying based on, I think he was just very single-minded, maybe more than that, because he's never said anything angry about Rebecca. He's not blamed her. Dina blamed her.
Yeah, yeah, definitely.
And Jonah fought that. So I would question that.
Maybe he just did
Dina
it to keep
definitely
them.
blamed her.
Yeah, maybe
Dina
he just did that to keep the two women from bumping into each other.
Yes,
at the hospital.
that's what he said he was doing.
Yeah, because
'Cause
that would make sense.
Or any of Dina's friends, because Dina was getting hysterical as it was, you know.
Yeah. To keep
Anyway, all right, so
Thank you so much.
this was fun.
This-
All those people missed out, but they can hopefully
They're going to have
watch
to
it.
follow. Yeah, they will watch it because I'll make sure that it's everywhere they can see it.
So tell me where you're going to put it so I know to go look for it as well.
Okay, what I'm going to do first is make sure the recording came out.
I hope so.
Fingers crossed. I hit the right
I
button.
saw it.
but
It said it's recording.
Yeah.
It's recording.
that it should have
Yeah.
worked. And then
Okay.
where I'll put it is for the book club members. I want to put it on my crime blog, Deranged LA Crimes. I'll put it there. I'll put it on. I have a Facebook page for that for Deranged LA Crimes. I'll put it there.
And you have a
And
YouTube thing you said also?
Yes, I do. I
Okay,
have a
good.
YouTube channel, and I'll
Well, you know,
put it there.
Facebook doesn't let anybody see YouTube stuff, but I post it
Right.
anyway. The secret is to put it in the comments. You
Yes.
get at least
Yes.
a little more views that way.
Yeah. Hey, you got to do what you got to do.
I
But this
know.
is so interesting. I'm so glad that you gave us your time.
Sure, it was
Yeah,
fun.
thanks so much for your
Thanks.
time.
It's just such an amazing story. It's really just a head scratcher. You know, I can't figure it out. But I'm looking
Everyone
forward to
should buy-
reading your novel.
Oh, good. Thanks.
Everyone should buy the book.
Thank
Yes,
you.
definitely.
Yes.
Because it really is. Because it was such. I mean, just such a fantastic case when it first broke, and just to see how you followed it through, you know, all the way. And again, like I said, I mean, you can just the whole journalist bulldog thing. It's like you got a hold of that, and you weren't going to let it go. And
You know what? Someone actually gave me a little ceramic bulldog one time and left it on my desk. It was so cute.
you know, that's the sheriff's homicide. That for LA, that's their mascot is the bulldog. So there's a lot to that. There are just some people that just grab a hold and won't let go, and I think you're one of them. So it's really been a joy to talk to you.
Thank you so much. I
Thank you
appreciate that.
so much.
All
It
right,
was
good.
nice
All right.
meeting you.
Safe,
You,
guys.
nice meeting you too. You guys have a good afternoon. All
Thank
right,
you.
bye-bye.
You too. Bye bye.